Well, hello everyone. I'm Peter Thorpe. I'm a director of Australian Bookkeepers Network. Today's webinar is brought to us by a great friend of ABN, Tracy Angwin of the Australian Payroll Association. Australian Payroll Association are the experts on all things payroll. G'day Tracy, how are you doing?
Good, thanks Pete. And you?
I am absolutely chipper, excellent, and looking forward to Christmas.
Good.
Just a recap on the purpose of today's webinar. This webinar is not so much focused on how Single Touch Payroll is intended to work. There's already plenty of material out there, including a tremendous recording of a bookkeeper radio session we did a few weeks ago, and that's freely available from the ABN website. This session today is really more focused on the things that we can do now, the things that we can do to be ready for Single Touch Payroll in really the weeks ahead, because if the government get their way, this thing is operational in a matter of weeks, and there's some key dates and things in there. So look, Tracy, over to you. Actually, before we get over to Tracy, just a quick reminder on Q&A. By all means, type your questions into the Q&A box. Tracy will see them. If they're urgent, she might touch on them. Otherwise, we'll get to them at the other end. So over to you, Tracy.
Thanks very much for that introduction. For those of you who haven't met me, you may not know that I'm also in my spare time write books about payroll. And the other thing that we do that you may not be aware of at Australian Payroll Association is an annual benchmarking report. We've actually got a survey open for the 2018 payroll benchmarking survey now. So if anyone would like to contribute to complete that survey, you'll actually get a copy of the results when they are out in February, when we publish that. So today's webinar is all about what employers need to do and the questions they need to have answers to be ready for Single Touch Payroll on the 1st of July 2018. Single Touch Payroll really is a new way for government to think about streamlining reporting from employers in relation to payroll. Essentially, it's reporting the information that's on a payment summary plus superannuation to the ATO every time you run a pay. And that is, of course, every time every employer runs a pay, whether they have their payroll in-house, whether it's outsourced, or whether a bookkeeper or an accountant runs their payroll for them. The ATO call this a payroll event. So you'll see that a lot, this reference to this thing called a payroll event. It really just means a pay process. The ATO also want to know when employers have new starters, and when you have new starters, when you terminate people and what you pay in between. There's actually a range of views in the payroll sector about the implications of Single Touch Payroll. They range from, the sky is falling, it's going to cost tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to be STP ready. A lot of sort of big consulting firms are going with that line at the moment to large employers. To the other end of the spectrum, where some are saying, there's absolutely nothing to worry about because it's your vendor's problem, your payroll vendor's problem. And I guess the truth is actually somewhere in between those two views. It certainly shouldn't be an expensive consulting exercise. You shouldn't be, thinking that you need, your expensive consultants or large amounts of input from your accountant or bookkeeper to actually become compliant. But, the responsibility is not really a software provider's issue. The responsibility does fall to the employer. So it's definitely not a case of sticking your head in the sand and hoping that your supplier figures it out. So we need to be really focused on what we need to know to be ready for July next year. There's certainly been plenty of information from various sources about what Single Touch Payroll, or STP, is. I prefer to call it STP. Every time I see the tax office, I tell them how Single Touch Payroll is a terrible, terrible name for this regulation. But there's very little information about helping employers to actually get ready for it. And to be fair, there hasn't actually been a lot of detailed information on the specifics of Single Touch Payroll until fairly recently. But with a legislated date of the 1st of July 2018 for large employers, it is definitely time to get cracking. So today I'm going to focus on 4 things that employers need to consider prior to going live with STP. They are the quality of the payroll, of the current payroll data, the end-to-end payroll process, what technology you will use when STP starts, and what employee communication strategy that you will need. And when I say you, I mean you as an employer and you as in your clients as employers. So you may have seen this ATO slide showing how STP is designed to work in its most simple fashion. The employer reports the payments that have been made to the employees, as well as the superannuation contribution amounts. They are reported to the ATO by the employer, and the ATO will also be getting superannuation paid amounts from the super fund. So employers pay their PAYGW as they do normally, and employees will also have more choice in how to complete their tax file number declarations and super forms online. That is it's really the digitisation of this communication with the ATO. This slide here gives a little more detail about how the old payment summary and tax file number declarations are replaced in a post-STP digital environment. STP is really designed to be based on your current payroll process and uses standard business reporting to allow you to send a file at each payday or payroll event to the ATO. Now, the ATO want that file on or before the pay event. The ATO then matches that information against various sources of data, and that would be both employer and employee records. So this means your employees will be able to view their super contributions, and ultimately the ATO will be able to reconcile the amount of super an employer has reported to have paid against what has actually been received by the super funds. Now, obviously there's going to be some reconciliation conversations there, but essentially the ATO is going to make sure employers are actually paying the super, the SG contribution, not just reporting that it is to be paid. All information will ultimately be available to employees in MyGov as part of the ATO online service, and that includes pre-filled payment summaries. So that's the plan, to have pre-filled payment summaries through the service. Now, the deadline of the 1st of July 2018 is for what the ATO is calling substantial employers. So that is a term for those employers with 20 or more employees. So what each employer has to do is to do a head count, and this is a head count, not an FTE count, it's a head count, as at the 1st of April next year. And if at that date you have 20 more employees, you are classed as a substantial employer. So what to do first? The basis for being ready for STP is all about your data. As you'll be reporting every payroll that you do, as I said, the ATO calls this the pay event. The legislation says actually that you need to report your pay event, as I say, prior to or on the day that you pay employees. So STP will become very difficult for employers who don't have up-to-date clean data in their payroll systems. And therefore, really what we need to do first is to be thinking about how to ensure the quality of your data is accurate and up to date. And when I say up to date, I mean also up to date at the tax office, because they want to. I've had some people who say, "Oh, I think my payroll system's all up to date with, for example, correct addresses," but the employee might have advised the employer that they've changed address, but not the tax office. So those things have to match. Initially, just take a look at your employee data, and perhaps, what I'm suggesting to people at the moment is to ask all employees to confirm the information that you hold on them is correct. Things like their full legal name. So if their name is Frederick and you've got Fred in the payroll, it needs to be Frederick. Their mobile number, their email address, their residential address, and their date of birth. These needs to be identical to the records that the ATO have, and none of those fields in the employee master file can be blank. So if they're wrong or they're blank, especially when onboarding to STP, that will trigger issues for the employer. Now, this is especially in relation to SG. Employers with poor quality data will be exposed very, very quickly. And there will be all sorts of notifications from the ATO. And although the ATO are quite that they are aware that they don't want to be blasting employers with lots of notification emails. The cleaner that your data is, the less you'll hear from the ATO about STP. Actually checking the data is actually quite a simple process, but from my experience, what it does is it takes time. So I'd recommend that all employers start now to do this. You might be using self-service. So if your self-service has the capability, perhaps you can ask your employees to check their details in there and advise you when they've done this. Some self-services, you can have sort of like a tick box to advise the employer that you've done that. Other employers are looking to print all the employee details and have the employee physically check them and sign them off. Each organisation will be different, but this is something that's very important to do before you go live with STP. The next thing to think about in relation to the data and the setup of your payroll systems is the setup of your pay codes or elements of pay. Regardless of what you call them in your software, some of the things that you need to assess is whether they are set up correctly in relation to where they should be on the payment summary, their tax treatment, and whether or not superannuation is payable on them, and how year-to-date figures are treated. So year-to-date figures are going to be very important from an STP point of view. As I said, STP will work with your natural payroll processes, so it's very important to make sure that your process works with the STP requirements. Employers with multiple payroll systems or duplicate data or multiple databases to keep information, those who use spreadsheets outside of the payroll system or have frequent adjustments or paper-based payroll forms or just generally poor payroll practices may be exposed with the implementation of STP. You'll be able to include any new starters in the payroll event file. So this is how you'll get your start date and your tax file number reported to the ATO. And likewise, when an employee terminates, this is reported in the payroll event. All the information that the ATO want you to send them needs to come directly from your payroll system in a specific format and in a particular file. So you need to make sure that all of the relevant data is in one place, which is your payroll system. So you may need to change your payroll processes to make sure this can happen. One of the things I think is actually going to be a real benefit from STP is the focus that organisations will have to have on their payroll processes. If you've been running the same payroll processes for years with no thought about how it can be improved or made more efficient, the implementation of STP is a great reason to essentially lift the bonnet of your payroll operation and have a good look at what you do and why. So if you or your clients use any spreadsheets, any paper, any manual calculations or adjustments in your payroll process, by looking at ways of getting rid of these, you'll not only be closer to complying with STP, but you'll actually have a much more efficient payroll processes with better governance than you did before. If you've got any specific questions around this, I'm happy to answer them at the end of the webinar or afterwards. Just let me know. Or I actually can't see the question box, but if you put them in there, Peter is keeping an eye on those. So the major thing that all significant employers will need to consider is the payroll system they're using and how it works with STP. The thing that's been confusing for employers, I think, is when payroll vendors say that they are STP compliant. It's really important to understand what they mean by being STP compliant. So we need to find out what STP compliant means to your vendor, because they will all be potentially different. There's two main things to consider when you're looking at to be compliant with STP. Firstly, there is the producing and sending of the file to the ATO in the format that they require. It's important to note here that the file that you send will include year-to-date figures for gross taxable wages, tax withheld, and super. And it's important and this is important when it comes to how changes and mistakes and adjustments are handled. So essentially, the design framework for each STP file that is transmitted will replace the file that the ATO is currently holding on each employer. The guidance from the ATO is that employers should just fix any issues in their data within 14 days of becoming aware of it, and then you submit, and then subsequent submissions of the payroll event files will just overwrite any that have problems with them. So there's been a lot of essentially scaremongering around in the payroll community with people saying, oh, every time you make a payroll mistake, you're going to have to report it to the ATO. That's just not the case. The second thing to consider is how the messaging from the ATO is handled by your software provider, if at all. Now, not all software providers are dealing with messaging, and the ones that aren't will still say they're STP compliant. And this is where it's really, really important to understand what it is that your vendor is actually delivering. So there'll be many ways that software providers deal with messaging. Some will send messaging directly to their self-service system. So employees and people who are running payrolls and management can see and view messages and balances directly. Others will send them to MyGov. Others will use a third-party gateway to manage the messaging service. It's important to ask your vendor what mechanism that they intend to use and whether they support your preferred option when it will be available for testing. Because what I've seen recently is a lot of employers are saying, my software vendor is saying they're only going to produce the file. Getting it to the ATO and managing the messaging is now my problem. So they've got to go and find a third-party vendor that manages that. So really, really important to get that right. So the other thing to ask them while you're sort of at it, ask them what they might be able to do in the future if they are going down the messaging path. For example, if they can bring messages back from the ATO, and as such, they might be able to build that integration into your self-service system. So your employee only needs to go to one place to find all the information that for Single Touch Payroll, they don't necessarily need to go to to MyGov. For example, the ATO, this is actually the plan. It's not actually in the legislation yet, but they are planning to provide a pre-populated payment summary to your employees through MyGov. And what I would be asking my software provider is, can they take that data and provide pre-populated payment summaries to your self-service system? That would be, in my view, it's what I would want to be looking at as my sort of first choice for payroll best practice. Another question for your payroll supplier is exactly what costs there might be to implement STP, both upfront and an ongoing basis. There are some third-party vendors that might provide their technology to your payroll supplier free of charge, but there's potentially a cost levied on the employer. So you need to specifically ask what, if any, implementation costs will be incurred by the employer and whether there are ongoing fees or charges to submit the file to the ATO. Whether there'll be any training required, and if so, what costs might be associated with that, and what other resources you might require and at what cost. So there are certainly third-party systems who say they can do all this, but there's actually a charge to the employer, and I've seen it as high as 10 cents per employee per payroll event. So if you've got larger employers who are paying weekly pays, that could be a pretty expensive exercise. So just make sure you really understand the costs up front. Another critical piece of information to understand from your payroll vendor or service provider is exactly how the file gets to the ATO and how long it will take. Is it a direct process or is there a third party involved? And if there's a third party, how long will the process take? As this will inform as to whether you're compliant with legislation or not. Remember, the legislation says the file has to be at the ATO before or on the day of the payroll event. Some software will actually use the messaging service to tell you that your file has been successfully lodged, and some won't. So it's important to understand, again, from your vendor what ATO messaging you'll receive and whether you need to log into the ATO business portal to pick up those messages. Essentially, in summary, the things that you need to ask your software provider include whether they're sending data in real time to the ATO, and therefore whether you'll be compliant with the legislation that says you need to provide the data before or on the date of the payment to the employee. You need to know exactly what has been delivered to the ATO, what the process is from a payroll point of view, what authorizations are required, are there any third parties involved, and are there costs to the employer of this process, and also have they had their STP processes certified by the ATO, which is, the ATO is happy to do that. So that will, if they've been certified, that should also mean that it's being tested accordingly. Now, the ATO expects that not all employers will make the 1st of July deadline, but they have made it very clear that although they won't be penalising employers in the first 12 months, this is not a legislative holiday. They do expect that if you don't meet the 1st of July deadline, that you will be in communication with them about your progress towards it. And when I say you, I mean the employer. There is an STP deferrals and exemption framework that the ATO has published. Now, I will send a copy of that to Peter and the team at Australian Bookkeepers Network so they can share that with you. Some payroll vendors won't be ready and have already sought a deferral. If this is your payroll vendor, they will give you a deferral reference number, or DRN, which you can use as your deferral mechanism. So when the ATO calls you and says you haven't submitted your first payroll event, you can quote them your DRN, or deferral reference number. There are some, as I say, there are some payroll systems who have sought that deferral already. Employers, aside from that, can independently apply for a deferral if you won't be ready by the 1st of July 2018. If a deferral is granted, either directly or via your software provider, you'll need to meet the deferral date and will be expected to liaise with the ATO on your progress to do so. So examples of why an employer might request additional time might include not having adequate resourcing for implementing STP, having significant internal business changes. You might have some sort of global alignment or related entity, international entities issue. Or if you're covered by the commissioner-initiated deferral via your software provider, but require even more time in addition to the deferral date, you can apply for that. The ATO have made it clear that the things that they will not, the things that they will take into account when considering a deferral request include the circumstances that prevent the employer from adopting STP by the mandated date, the employer's ATO compliance history as a whole. That's really important. If you do nothing else, get the ATO compliance, up to date. Make sure you're lodging BAS on time and paying your fee, your tax on time, because this is going to be very important for STP. They'll also consider the steps already taken by the employer to mitigate the circumstances that are delaying the STP adoption. The value of the information provided in terms of asking for the deferral. The timing of when the STP-enabled product or service that they're actually intending to use is available. And they'll also consider the complexity of the employer's payroll arrangements, as they'll take into consideration if you're looking for a deferral. And also the size and structure of the employer, and the industrial complexity of the employer, and whether the ATO feels additional time requested is appropriate or reasonable. They are certainly not saying that anyone who applies for a deferral will get it. Essentially, you must show that your employer has a genuine desire to transfer to STP as soon as possible. So the whole kind of the dog ate my homework or any other such excuses are likely to be very frowned upon by the ATO. If you're providing a payroll outsourcing service and are unable to meet the deadlines, you will need to provide appropriate evidence as well. So when considering a payroll service deferral request, the ATO will assume that the payroll service provider, so that's you as a bookkeeper providing those services to your clients, they'll consider whether you're a tax or a BAS agent. That the service provider will prioritise client transition to STP with any relevant commissioner-initiated deferrals if applicable, and they will then want to ensure adherence to those deferral timelines where possible. So you'll have an account manager, which will be fun. I'm actually aware of at least 2 major payroll software providers who have already successfully sought STP deferrals at this stage. They should now be communicating this to their customers. Again, this is a key issue to discuss with your payroll supplier or service provider. What is their time frame to have a product to you to test? And if it doesn't give you enough time to be ready by the 1st of July, have they applied for a deferral? And if they haven't, then you should do that as the employer. If your provider is successfully granted a deferral, the provider will supply you the details, as they will have an ATO account manager to help them and monitor their progress to assist them to be ready for STP by the deferral date. And they will actually want they will be in regular contact with the service provider. It's not like I'm going to apply for a 3-month deferral and then you'll never hear from the ATO for the next 3 months. And just note that any deferral granted is a deferral for STP reporting. Obviously, it's not any extension time for any payments to the ATO. So what penalties exist for not being ready for STP? The initial thing that the ATO will actually be looking at is for you to lodge the STP file on time. That's the main thing. And the ATO will actually use a history of your first few lodgements along with an understanding of your payroll schedule to predict your future lodgement date. So you won't actually need to be telling the ATO when your pay dates are. They will use their systems to work that out. As I say, the legislation says you've got to provide the file to the ATO before or on the day of payment to your employees. So I did say to them, how were they going to manage if someone was consistently late? So because they wouldn't necessarily be able to tell, but they seem to think that they'll be able to figure it out. So within 24 hours of a missed lodgement, they're not going to give you a lot of time. You can expect a message or a nudge from the ATO to advise you that a lodgement has been missed. If this is a regular occurrence, you can expect more attention from the ATO. The ATO will actually be focusing on long-term patterns in both lodgements and data. And if they find issues, they'll share with you what treatment responses, and this will essentially be related to a history of past behaviour with the ATO. So if the employer has a history of missing lodgement payments and a history of outstanding debts, you can expect any STP issues to be escalated quite quickly. If the employer has a clean record with the ATO, you might expect some leniency in relation to STP. And they're talking about different lanes. They're talking about red lanes, amber lanes, and green lanes. And they will actually be very transparent with you as to which lane that you're in and how you, if you're in the red lane, how you can get out of it. And if you're in the green lane, how you got to the amber lane. The ATO have definitely communicated that they are engaging in more of a help and assistance style in relation to STP rather than a big stick approach for the first 12 months. The tax office have been quite upfront, in fact, about how they will deal with non-lodgements and other compliance issues around STP. Like I say, they've got past behaviour information for all employers, and this will be the basis of how the ATO manages each employer with STP. So essentially, you've got the next 7 months, a little less than 7 months, to make sure that all your clients' lodgements are in on time, up to date, and all the debts are paid, because that will stand you in the best stead of not getting the, any unwanted attention from the ATO relation to STP. As I say, employers will be told by the ATO what their engagement risk is based on the principles regarding lodgement and compliance, and there'll be plenty of transparency regarding this from them. And the engagement risk, these red lane, green lane things, will be the basis of how each employer is treated. Are your lodgements, I say, historically late, and if late, how late? If the ATO haven't received your late lodgement by the next due date, they will treat it as a missed lodgement. Now, there's not too much of an issue if an employer catches up, but as I said, this will depend on your past behaviour as an ATO client. If the employer has significant debt, the ATO may make intervention early. If it's just a missed lodgement for an employer with a good record, the ATO may do nothing. Now, they're very, very focused on, the ATO know that particularly small business, the first indicator that there's an issue with small business is late lodgement. So they're going to take late lodgement very seriously, because they say that oftentimes by the time someone gets around to sort of following you up, the client could potentially be in serious financial trouble. So they're trying to find out if there are any financial difficulties earlier, so they can have a chance of at least getting their outstanding debt. It will be through, they've got some analytics, so they've got some, through some pattern detection methods that they will predict the due dates of your next reporting event, and that's how they'll recognise any misreporting STP files. So now, the ATO has already advised that they consider there will be a 12-month transition period in relation to penalties. Essentially, it means employers won't be subject to failure or late lodgement penalties for the first 12 months of STP reporting. But it's important to know that this isn't a 12-month compliance holiday, though. It's 12 months for employers to make sure they're getting it right, and hopefully it won't take any of your clients anywhere near that long. Finally, I wanted to talk to you about employee communication strategy and why you might need one, or certainly why your clients might need one. employees may or may not have ever heard of Single Touch Payroll. I know a lot of employers who haven't heard of Single Touch Payroll. And unlike many legislative changes that happen in the pay office, this one definitely affects our employees. The big one will be changes to how payment summaries will be delivered. Now, there's nothing to stop an employer, as long as it's supported by your payroll system, to provide payment summaries in the way that you do now. However, the end goal of STP is to provide them pre-filled to the employee. So this will either be through MyGov or directly through your payroll system using employee self-service. You need to make sure employees understand this change, as well as any transition implications from moving from one payroll system to the next, to another in the middle of a financial year, and not bringing across year-to-date figures, because, as I said, these figures that go in the file to the ATO will actually be year-to-date figures. So they, it might well be a case in this example of an employee may get one paper payment summary and one by MyGov in the first year. One of the things that has recently come to my attention is employees really needing to understand how this works, because the ATO will actually know pay by pay what their year-to-date balances are. So they'll know what they're getting paid every pay period in real time. Now, that is going to have potential implications on people on Centrelink payments or child support payments, things like that. So this is why it's got to be very clear to the employee exactly how STP is going to could affect them. If your employees are not registered with MyGov, we recommend that you encourage them to do so. They will need to link their MyGov accounts to the ATO, so you may need to provide them with some guidance on how to do that. Now, the ATO were asked in a meeting I was at the other day, what happens if someone refuses to have a MyGov account? And the answer was, well, if they want their payment summary, they would have to go to an ATO shop front and ask for one. Or if they also wanted their year-to-date, if you wanted to know what the ATO figures sort of year-to-date were on you, you would have to go to an ATO shop front to do that. There's no laws at this stage passed regarding payment summaries, but it's important to understand where the ATO is taking this digital initiative and plan for the future. And they are very clear that this is what they're going to do. They're going to deliver pre-filled payment summaries via MyGov. This includes the way that you want to provide payroll information and payment summaries to your employees. I know some employers will continue to provide payment summaries in the way they do now. It's just going to be really important to make sure that they actually match the information that the ATO has. One thing that employees will need to understand clearly, as I say, is the transparency with STP and payroll to Centrelink and child supports and any other payments that might be affected by payroll. Because in the future, and as I said, I was at the ATO on Monday at an employee engagement meeting about this, certainly they made it very clear that in the future, both federal and state agencies will be sharing this information. That includes offices of state revenue in each of the states. So, again, you need to understand what implications this might have on both the employer and the employees. An extension to this, and also something to consider for the future, is what will happen when the ATO gets feed from super funds. So that's due to sort of be 6 months after the introduction of STP. In theory, the ATO will be able to compare the superannuation that you've calculated for your employees against what has actually been received by the super fund. And all of this will be transparent to the employee via your self-service system or MyGov. So any employers that are not... So what's going to happen is you're going to send your file to the ATO, and they're going to make sure that that you're paying the appropriate amount of super, as much as they can, because, as I say, it's gross taxable wages, not ordinary time earnings that are sent to the ATO. And then they're going to check that you've actually made those contributions to the super fund, because we're going to get reporting back to the super fund, and the employee will actually be able to see if there are any discrepancies there. Again, it's important to consider this when you're planning your STP readiness strategy, and whether the future payroll delivery strategy, what it is at each of your organisations that you run payroll for. Now, there's a lot of other information we could discuss in relation to STP along the lines of technology, but for the purposes of today, I wanted to give you some practical tips on how you can ensure that your organisation and the organisations that you are working with are ready for STP by the 1st of July 2018. I'll actually provide some documentation to the team at ABN, which summarises this presentation, and also the deferral document from the ATO. We do have some time left. I deliberately have sort of planned about 35 minutes to speak to you, because I wanted to have, to look at any questions that you might have. So if you haven't already, just type your questions into the chat box and I'll try and answer as many as I can. Peter, I actually can't see that chat box, so would you mind, if there are questions, relaying them to me?
All right, Tracy. We've got a small technical hitch here, and you can't see Q&A, and neither can we.
Okay, awesome.
So what we're going to do to work around that is that I'm working on the presumption that everyone online has the ability to Q&A, and what I'm going to ask is, if you've got a burning question, is if you could rekey it into chat, which we have got, and I'll start relaying those through to Tracy. And some people have already been doing that. And if you have already gone or what have you, we'll see if we can extract any of the questions from Q&A after the event, and we'll feed those through to you, Tracy, and cool. we can deal with them subsequently. So, look, I'll start with what's on chat at the moment, and I'll just feed them through to you. So you'll have to put up with my interpretation here, and I'm going to do my best to get to the essence of what the question is.
No worries. I do. There are certainly some frequently asked questions which I could certainly go through as well, but let's see what we've got. Okay.
So let's say we've got, and this is a question I've had in my brain, and I think you'll probably find this one is a little bit common. Software is going to be an issue here. And clearly you talked about having the right software and the right processes and stuff in place. So let's say you've got an employer with no software at all. Are they going to be essentially compelled to find STP compliant software?
Yes.
Okay. I figured that was going to be your answer.
That was the easiest question. Now, the thing is, remember, I'm assuming that most employers that have no payroll software have less than 20 employees. If they're more than that, they should be getting some software anyway. So remember that the smaller than 19 and under have got an extra 12 months for STP.
Correct. Well, that actually goes to a question here from Megan, and she's saying, okay, I've got an employer with less than 20 employees, and they're still using, she says, MYOB software. Now, I'm assuming that's an old desktop version. Mm-hmm. May well not be supported into STP compliance into the future. A question was really, do I have to the 1st of July 19 to get my software act in order with that employer?
That's exactly right, Megan.
And is it fair to say that that less than 20 is still measured against the 1st of April?
Correct. Every year. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Now, next one down here I've got is from Kate. And it's about, you talked about data matching with the tax office records, and I think there's an email field on there as well. Let's say an employee, what do you do when an employee doesn't have an email address?
Well, as long as they don't have one with the ATO, should be fine.
Okay, so blank, a blank matching blank is still a valid.
Well, you know what? They're saying that any blank files, any blank fields will be rejected. Yeah. So whether or not you might want to put like a payroll at, ABN, ostbook.net, I would almost have a default email address that comes to me if someone doesn't have an email address.
Okay, so you got an employee who is a Luddite with no email address. Yeah. You can put a default as maybe.
Look, I would because any blank fields are going to be rejected.
Yeah. Okay.
And as long as you say to the employee, "You okay that I do this?" I'm sure that they will be.
They're probably.
Not, I don't know. It's just going to keep getting rejected.
Question about, let's say there's a public holiday in the period that results in a late lodgement of STP. Does that mean it defaults to the next day after, or?
It has to be the day that you pay. So it has to be the day that you pay people. So I'm assuming that if there's a public holiday, you'll probably pay people the day before.
Right.
So that's when the STP file will be due.
Yep. Okay.
Look, and I think things like that, one day late, and it's not going to be the end of the world. But if you are consistently late, that's when the ATO, they're just saying they're going to give some extra attention to those employers. And it's because they know that late lodgement is the first key indicator for a company that's in trouble financially.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I think we already solved this one. What's the compliance date for employers with less than 20 employees? Well, that's
July 19.
But still measured, not what your payroll is in July 19. It's still measured against your payroll headcount.
Well, it'll be all employers by then. So if you've got if you've got, you either get the extra year or you don't. Even if you've got one employer, you're still up for it.
But if you've got 25 now and you're going to have 25 at the 1st of April coming, and you're going to have 5 after that because you're going to close a division, you're still caught. You're in.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Question here from Iris. How will the tax office distinguish from gross taxable wages for the SGC amount and not all, because not all wage categories attract SGC. So how are they going to actually...
This is the best question ever, and one I regularly put to the tax office.
Yeah.
They can't.
And look, I've had this issue come up before, and I think that's the answer. If they're trying to match to SGC, from their end, it's going to be an approximate exercise. It's not going to be perfection on a stick. Is that fair call?
Yeah, and what they're going to do, because I also asked them the same thing, and to be fair, it's been a huge, like the ATO are experts in tax. They're not experts in payroll. So it's been actually a huge learning curve for them.
Yeah.
How payroll actually works.
Because they haven't done this before, have they?
It's quite amusing, I must say. They're very nice people that I'm working with on the employee engagement committee. But and they know how much they don't know, so they're not being arrogant about it at all. But they're just trying to do the right thing. So there's a couple of strategies. There will be times, like for example, if you're a labour hire company and you have people working at pubs on weekends, and it's every hour that you work on a weekend is overtime, well, your SG will be 0.
Yeah. Yep.
So what they will do then is they will group employers and they will compare you to what they call nearest neighbour.
Yeah.
So they'll say, okay, we get that if you're a labour hire company, your SG is probably going to be, lower. But if you're a suburban accounting firm, your SG is probably going to be closer to 9.5%.
Yeah.
So they will compare industries.
Yep.
But they're not going. They know that they can't just say if SG is less than 9.5% of gross taxable wages, there's a problem. They get that.
Yeah.
So, if there's something, if they think that there's something up, they're not going to call you. They tell me this. They're not going to call you and say your SG's wrong. They'll say, "Could you please explain to me?"
Yeah.
How this is calculated and why the discrepancy might be. And you might say, because we run respite care and we have 30% of our wages are overtime.
I suspect they're going to be a lot more interested in ones where SDP says the super amount should be 20 grand and your super fund is saying the answer received is nil.
Correct. Yes, they'll catch those ones out as well.
Yeah. And that's probably a good point. This is probably the first time for all of the reporting on pay slips of super and all the rest of it. This is probably the closest they're going to get to be able to track down errant employers who aren't paying super, isn't it? But it's still not going to be a precise...
Look, it won't be, but they've got some pretty good data analytics, and they have data scientists, and they have some pretty clever technology. So they won't necessarily be able to identify that day one, but with data modeling and with this nearest neighbour concept and with industry, comparison and stuff, they will take them time, but they will be able to do that quite accurately. And you know what? And I have suggested to them, and they sort of, for phase 2, that they actually do change the file and they do separate ordinary time earnings with other wages.
Okay. Hey, a question from Vera, I think it is, and she's joined the seminar late, or the webinar late, and she's got a couple of questions just about availability of slides and checklists. Now, just to alleviate any stress, yes, all slides and the checklist too. I think we talked about.
I'll flick you something that I've put together, which sort of just is a fairly basic checklist to think about. So, as well as the document that the ATO put out on deferrals.
Wonderful, and we will email those out to all webinar participants. So rest easy, you will receive them. There is a question here about clearinghouses, and it says, currently use a clearinghouse for monthly super payments.
Mm-hmm.
Would that comply if we made weekly payments? So
Weekly super payments.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the clearinghouse, see, at the moment, the clearinghouse just clears the super.
Yeah.
You've got to be able to send the file.
Correct.
So there are actually, like, for example, the Westpac clearinghouse is going to turn into a Westpac clearinghouse plus STP compliance messaging system.
Yeah.
So this is why it's really important to talk to your software vendor about what solutions, what partners that they're working with to make sure that their clients are compliant. And there's a couple of software vendors who have already come out and said, we're just doing the file, the rest is up to you. Now, probably not, those software companies are probably unlikely to have small business clients, but it's, I'd be wanting, and I haven't had the conversation with, Xero or MYOB or about how it's going to work. I probably should. But certainly that's a question for them.
Yeah, terrific. Hey, question here from someone who is into pain. It says, I've got 5 employees. Can I opt in from the 1st of July 18, knowing that...
You certainly can, and the ATO will love you for it.
Wonderful. Look, it's probably not a bad way to go.
I'm going to do it, Peter. I'm going to do it.
No, it's a fair call, and it gives you a chance to get used to the system and probably without the connotations of non-compliance, because you're ahead of the game. So rather than waiting for 12 months and hoping it all works, it's probably a good point. And I believe you don't have to start on the 1st of July. You can start at any stage after that date. So if you're ready, why not?
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to do exactly that, because I got better things to worry about on the 1st of July 2019 than STP. I think it's quite nice for those of us with less than 20 employees, because we can actually do it at a time that suits us.
Yeah.
Up until the 1st of July 2019.
Yep. No, good question. Question here from Sue. As a PBI, our staff salary sacrifice certain expenses. Are you aware of how this will be processed in the electronic reporting, and if the tax office will take up the reportable fringe benefits section on the payment summaries?
Yep. Very good question. And actually that was one of my other frequently asked questions that I would have brought up if no one asked it. So it's actually super simple. All you need to report on is your gross taxable wages.
Yeah. And
your PAYGW and your super. FBT will be reported as you currently do, and the ATO will take that information to pre-fill the payment summaries at the end of the year.
Right. So does that mean you actually report that in toto at the end of the year to the tax department who put them onto the payment summaries?
Correct.
Right. Okay.
That's a theory.
Yep.
I'm not saying it's going to work. I'm just saying that's what they intend to do. But look, I'm not being sort of smart aleck about it, but I know for our payroll, we are highly likely to provide payment summaries electronically in the way that we do now for the foreseeable, for probably at least the next year to 2 years, if STP allows us to still do that.
Yeah. There's a question here from Norm. It says, can I start after the 1st of July 18, perhaps September, October? If I get this right, so long as you're under the 20 employees by the 1st of April, sure. If you're not, then no, it's the 1st of July 18.
Yeah, exactly.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, exactly. If you've got if you've got 20 or more on the 1st of April, you are the 1st of July. If you want the 1st of September, you've got to apply for a deferral, and you've got to have evidence, not just, hey, I'm a nice bloke, can you give me they won't accept that. And in fact, they will get quite suspicious of that. The amount of times that they talk about this, late lodgement is the major indicator for financial stress. They talk about that all the time. Yeah. So all that will do is send a red flag to the ATO.
Right. Question here from Patricia. We pay prior to the end of a pay period. I'm not sure what that means. And make any adjustments the following week. Okay. Yep. Is that going to comply? Right now, I am off for 3 weeks, and we'll set up the pays for the next lodgement. Where am I?
So again, it's exactly the same. You will have adjustments every payroll because assuming because people could have sick days and things like that. Again, all you need to do for every pay period is report your gross taxable wages, super, PAYG, etc. And remembering that every lodgement is year-to-date figures. So it will be the year-to-date changes. So that is completely fine. The ATO doesn't matter whether you're paying in arrears or in advance. They just want to know what you pay. Yeah,
that's my understanding. Is that they're leaving. They're not asking you to prove any adjustments or reconciliation items. They're just asking for the totals. They're saying, okay, what's the pay period you got? What's my year to date? And we'll adjust to what you say. Is my understanding. So if an employer has 20 employees on May the 1st, not April the 1st, what's the obligation to self-sign up for STP?
No obligation.
So they get the extra 12 months?
Yeah.
Cool. Question from Renata. What about an employer who has one employee who is on salary and gets the same pay every period, and the payroll gets processed every quarter for super and BAS lodgement? What happens here? So they're saying, is there an exemption because you got one employee? Is my reading of the question?
No, you can't pay people every quarter. I'm assuming that is an owner.
I think we were talking about there is the reporting the BAS and the super obligations once a quarter.
Yeah, so the BAS
pay periods weekly or monthly, but
the BAS is still okay quarterly, but you need to because you can't really have quarterly. I suppose you could. If it's an owner, I'd be okay with it. Maybe but if it's an employee, you can't do that. You can't play an employee.
No, I think what you're saying is the pay period might be weekly or monthly, and we're dealing with the STP, the super and the withholding once a quarter. But is there an exemption for a single person employee? No. Simple answer is
still
no.
Every week, say you're paying weekly, but you're actually physically paying your super quarterly, which is completely normal. You still have to calculate your super every week. Now, the first week, if they're under 450 for the month, it will be zero.
Yeah.
For example. So one of the things the ATO did mention the other day on Monday, which is that they, as part of this, they see that they will be able to catch owners of businesses who pay themselves wages but don't pay themselves super.
Yeah,
that's a big group of people that they.
It is my understanding. It's not an insubstantial number, and
they know that.
All over this. Yeah,
and then so. Either they need to get some tax advice from their accountant, how to pay themselves something other than wages, or they need to start paying themselves super.
Yeah. A follow-up question here from Patricia for an earlier one. It says, won't a default email address that we said I will put a generic one, will it not match with the tax office records?
That you'd need to put it with the tax office records as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. And the question here from Della.
Something like 99.2% of Australians have email addresses or something they were saying the other day. Like, it's not going to be a big problem.
No.
Or use your mum's email address or use your brother's or... as long as it matches.
One.
Yeah.
There's a question, I think, from Della, I think we've sort of covered. It says, what happens if you've got a closely held and only processed payroll when you do the tax return? Again, there's no exemptions for the little guys there. The only exemption you got is the extra 12 months to get your stuff in order.
And I go back to make sure your payroll processes are sound, because that's not such a good idea. Again, unless you're an owner-operator of a business and that's how you choose to do it. But that the owner-operators of businesses are people that they are trying to catch out in this.
Yeah. Question from Amanda. How do we know if, as an employer, whether the address the employee has listed with the tax office is going to match? They may have moved from this year to that. There's got to be mismatch records, aren't there? So
exactly. And what you'll find is the first lodgement that comes back, that's when you'll find out.
Yeah, and then they'll report the mismatches, and then you get to rectify. Yeah. Question from Kim. Advise name of software providers that have requested deferrals, i.e. their software won't be compliant on time. Are you aware of many software providers that have...
Two. I'm aware of two that have successfully been given the deferral. There may well be more that I don't know about.
I've heard of one, and it's one of the big guys.
They're both fairly big. Certainly one won't be doing any small business payrolls, but there is another one of the biggest payroll companies in Australia for sure.
Yeah.
So it will affect a lot of employers.
Yep. What happens? This is one I think we might have dealt with from Amber. It says, what happens if you've lodged an STP, then have an adjustment to the pay run? Understand tax office will have the balance loaded. MyGov, will MyGov be updated with adjustments made to STP on a timely basis?
I would.
Simple answer is yes, isn't it?
Yeah, look, you just do the adjustment, and then that will become form part of the year-to-date figure in the next lodgement.
Yeah.
If you really wanted to, you could lodge again, but I don't think there's any need to do that.
No. One from Mandy. The not-for-profit organisation I work for processes 3 pay runs on 3 different days each fortnight for 12 different entities.
Yeah.
Will we have to lodge 3 files on the days we process?
Yep.
Yeah.
So what happens, and this is also for those who have multiple databases. So the file has certain identifiers in it. One of the identifiers is the software that you use, and the other identifier is the ABN of the company, and there's another identifier which is some tax office identifier. So what it will actually do is it will know for each file what the ABN is. Does sound like might if possible would be good to streamline that process. But yes, every time you run a pay, you will need to send a file to the ATO. So if you're doing 12 a fortnight or whatever those numbers were, that's how many times you. I'd want to not do that if I could help it.
Yeah.
Because the issue won't be actually lodging the file. The issue will be when the ATO come back with all the nudges and you're getting 12 different, confirmations and 12 different, this is wrong, nudges they call them. I wouldn't want that. The inbox is going to be full of ATO spam.
Yeah. No, I agree. Here's a tricky one. I haven't thought of this one. Let's say you've got contractors who you pay, but they meet the definition of employee for super guarantee purposes. So that tax department accept they're a contractor, but you're required to pay super under SGR 2005/1. So you're doing that, but there's no payroll numbers to report.
Yes. They have to go through a payroll. Essentially they're an employee.
So do you report wages as 0? Because they're not wages. I've got a few clients with this sort of situation. So they are tax department accept they're valid contractors, contract payments.
They need to pay SG for it.
Yeah, but for SG purposes, they meet the definition of someone you have to pay super for, even though it's accepted that they're a contractor. Or do you just ignore it?
Well, who's paying the super? Are you paying the super, or is the contractor paying the super?
No. So I've got 2 people. One's an employee and one's a contractor. The contractor might work labour only, and he might work for 2 or 3 other people. But because he meets the definition of the super guarantee under that old super guarantee ruling, I have to pay super for him, even though the tax department 100% accept that he's a contractor.
And do you pay the super via your super? Are they in payroll at the moment, and you pay super when you pay?
Well, they wouldn't fit within a payroll system because they're not an employee. So
you don't pay the super with their tax. Like, how do you pay them super now? Do you just add it to the tax invoice and pay them, or do you actually pay the super fund?
No, actually pay the super directly. Okay. You've got an SG obligation.
If you're actually paying the super fund directly through an SG obligation, they need to be on your payroll, and the wages could be 0 and the super could be whatever the super is.
Yeah, and that'll be one of those funny reconciliation items.
And you'll get a call from the tax office.
Yeah.
And you'll just explain that that's how it is, and then they'll put that on your file, and you'll hopefully never have that question again.
Yeah, good.
There's going to be a lot of that.
I know.
There's going to be a lot of that.
Yeah. Got one here. Can employers with, say, 5 employees start any time before? Yeah, we've dealt with that one, so that's cool. Does the timing of the payment to the tax office for pay-as-you-go become the same as like an IAS? Does it become the same as the payroll event once STP starts? No.
That was, I think, their first idea, and I think that I think the government would have changed or something.
I think it was. I think there was such a hue and cry over timing of payments and saying, you want this in, and you're going to bring the cash flow bring forward would have been far too great. So they said, look, we still want this to happen. So how about we just forget about that?
No one's going to admit it now, but for sure that was what they were trying to do.
Yeah. Okay, I think we answered that one. And who are the payroll providers who have already applied for deferral? I suspect those particular software companies will be letting their people know.
Exactly.
So they're not going to be left in the dark. If they've got an exemption, they would be remiss if they weren't. Otherwise, they might have people leaving them in droves. So I'm sure they'll be hearing directly from the software company. Patricia's back on the default company email address entered. Would a default company email address entered to avoid blank spaces then match with tax? Oh,
yeah, we've had that.
It'll come up with a mismatch.
Yeah.
I think we've dealt with various. I'm a BAS agent. Get some of my stuff. Clients give me stuff at the end of a quarter. We know that they have to comply in line with their payroll runs. Tracy, I've been going for a while here, and the actual list of questions to get to is actually getting longer than when I started.
Why don't we? Can you maybe get a copy of those questions, and if you send them to me, I will type the answers to them and group them, and then you can send that out with the checklist.
That's a good point. So I know where I'm up to. So what we'll do is, if anyone's got any last minute questions, key them into chat. We will record them and feed them through if they're new and unique questions. I've got one question because I didn't get to ask any because none of the questions I asked were mine. So I got a little one. Have you heard? I mean, there was talk early on through the process of implementing this system that because it's going to be all these people are going to have to come up with software, that the government was going to come up with an alternative. Have you heard talk of that?
No.
And knowing how long it takes to write payroll software, what's the chances that they could actually have one written?
Somewhere between Buckley's and none. Yeah.
That's what I figured.
Yeah. Look, there is the only thing I've heard of them, and it was only this week, is that they will be providing small business with training. So, and I don't know what that means, payroll training, what it might look like.
Yeah.
But no, look, I mean, you can get, if you've got less than 5 employees, you can get free software that does all the stuff and automates it. And if you've got up to 20, look, it's not that much. It's not free, but it's not much more than free.
Yeah.
So I think that I think it is reasonable to expect small business to get digital.
Look, and I think that's my understanding is they worked out that they can't. Originally, they were talking about exemptions for this group and exemptions for that. I think they've now come somewhat harder and said the only conceivable exemptions, my understanding, are for those that don't have internet service, and they're monitoring the broadband network to make sure that as soon as these guys do have service, they do have software. So my understanding, the outs will be very, very few. So outs are people that don't have software or computers or that sort of stuff. My understanding is that's something you have to tame before this all starts. So I think people have to understand they need STP compliant payroll software.
Yep. Exactly.
Yeah.
And if it's honestly, if it's a big enough issue, they should just get someone else to do their payroll, whether that be your bookkeeper, or payroll provider, or whoever, your accountant.
That's a good point, isn't it? Like for most of the people here online.
Yep.
There you go. Most of the people online here are bookkeepers, so let your clients know they will have no outs, and you can look after their payroll for them, outsource service, and keep them compliant. So perhaps that's a good marketing line, isn't it?
Well, I mean, I'd be saying that, and I'd be getting on board with ABN Payroll and getting some good software and some good support, and actually make it a business strategy. Grow
a proper business out of it. You're dead right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, just a question on. I was at your conference earlier this year, and it was magnificent. Thank you. But you had a guy there from the UK, and they had. And they had implemented their version of Single Touch Payroll over there, and it was interesting to get his experience because, you hear a lot of the initial messaging, and it's going to be, oh well, if you're not ready and you don't do this and you don't do that, the world's going to end and everyone's going to get locked up. And his experience,
no one died.
His experience was quite interesting. That my understanding, and you correct me where I'm wrong, it didn't all go perfectly on day one, did it, for him?
No. They took really a few years to get it all right, and I think, to be fair, the ATO has a similar expectation.
Yeah, Yeah, I think that's if you're making a genuine effort and you're doing the right or attempting to do the right thing, there's going to be some leniencies, isn't there?
Yep. I think so.
I'm reading between the lines here, but to expect this thing to work absolutely perfection on a stick on the day is probably not a high chance of that happening for everyone.
No.
So it'll be a gradual process as people tame the various things that are thrown up at them that haven't worked.
Correct.
Look, we've got about 30 or 40 that we that are, again, these will be all follow-up questions towards the back end of it all, but we'll trap those, Tracy,
okay.
and we'll feed those through and we can answer those after the event. So I'm probably going to wrap it up now because we've gone past our time, and I'm going to say thank you very much for that. That was
anytime, my pleasure.
That was enlightening. There's some stuff there that I was unaware of, which was great. I thank you for that. And hopefully it's been some good learning there for those online. And as this thing unfolds, I think just keep watching this space, keep on top of it. There'll be tons more information coming on Single Touch Payroll. You got any final words for our people, Trace?
No. I just think, like I say, I think if I was a bookkeeper or an accountant, I'd certainly be taking the opportunity to suggest that this was another service that I could provide to my clients. And, if you've got good software and good communication and good support services around payroll, I don't think it's going to be too much of a drama. And it's going to, if you can take your payroll headaches away from your clients, well, and build that into as part of your revenue, well, everyone's a winner, I think.
Yep, clients included.
Yeah, exactly right. Absolutely.
Right. Yep. All right. Look, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we will say see you next time. Thanks again, Tracy.
No trouble at all. Bye-bye.
Bye.